Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our fifth panel, A World Without Nuclear Weapons, moderated by David Martin, Pentagon and National Security Correspondent for CBS. Our panelists include Dr. Shirin Ebadi, Dr. Jayantha Dhanapala, Dr. Ira Helfand, and Ms. Ingeborg Breines.
I'm David Martin, and welcome to our panel on A World Without Nuclear Weapons. Before we start, I want to remind everybody in the audience that near the end of this hour, we're going to go to questions from the audience, and you ask them by filling out a card, which is then brought up and I read out. I just, a short while ago, did an interview with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he said he liked young audiences best because they always tended to ask nasty questions. So feel free to ask us nasty questions. Before we start, I just want to outline a few principles that might help an audience, most of whom were not alive during the Cold War, which is the reason most of these nuclear weapons got built in the first place. First, even a limited nuclear war would be a global catastrophe. Second, in the nearly 7 decades since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there has not been another world war, and many people credit nuclear weapons with preventing World War III. The Cold War and its nuclear standoff with the USSR is over. Both sides can afford to drastically reduce their nuclear arsenals. The nuclear genie is out of the bottle. 8 countries, the US, Russia, France, Britain, China, Israel, India, and Pakistan, are known to have nuclear weapons. A 9th, North Korea, has detonated a nuclear device, and a 10th, Iran, is enriching uranium that might one day be used to build a nuclear weapon. Several states with nuclear weapons, South Africa, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Ukraine, have given them up. Other states like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Brazil have the capability to build nuclear weapons, but have decided they are better off without them. Deterrence, the threat of nuclear retaliation if attacked, probably won't work against terrorist groups. If Al-Qaeda gets a nuclear device, it will use it. And finally, and this is really why we're having this discussion, the proposition that nuclear weapons can be retained forever and never used, either accidentally or on purpose, is simply not credible. Getting rid of nukes is not just some blue sky, wouldn't it be nice idea. It is the declared intention of every country that has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As long ago as 1986, the chairman of this conference, then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, proposed to President Ronald Reagan the elimination of all nuclear weapons within 10 years. That didn't happen, but the idea has been endorsed by people like Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State George Shultz, and others who know what they're talking about when it comes to nuclear weapons. When you look at the world's intractable conflicts, you'd have to say nations aren't going to get rid of their nukes anytime soon. But the Cold War once looked intractable, and the Cold War is over. And the members of this panel are testament to the power of persistence in the face of seemingly intractable conditions. So I want to begin by asking a question of the panel, and whoever wants to answer should just jump in. Since the end of the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union have drastically reduced their nuclear arsenals. But at the same time, other countries, Pakistan, North Korea, are developing nuclear weapons. So is the world going in the right direction or the wrong direction when it comes to eliminating nuclear weapons?
Well, I think, first of all, your opening introduction is extremely useful because it sets the stage for a very important discussion on what is, in fact, the most destructive weapon ever invented. We have made substantial progress in reducing nuclear weapons, but there are still over 20,000 nuclear warheads amongst 9 countries, 95% of them owned by the United States and the Russian Federation. And some of them are deployed on operational basis, ready to be launched. So that's a very dangerous situation. Adding to that danger and complicating matters in terms of a comparison with the Cold War is the danger of terrorist groups acquiring nuclear weapons. And we know that there is proof of terrorist groups trying to acquire nuclear weapons, getting either uranium or plutonium, and making a dirty bomb, which is a certain amount of plutonium and uranium surrounded by conventional explosive material. So we are by no means out of the woods. The numerical reduction does not, in fact, give us any sense of security, because even one nuclear weapon is one too many.
Let's ask Dr. Helfand to give us an example of what happens when one nuclear weapon goes off.
Thanks. I think that the question, are we in a better place or a worse place, I'm not sure the answer to that. I think we're in a very bad place. And the problem is that we don't adequately understand how bad a place we're in. Since the end of the Cold War, there have been a couple of generations have come of age who really don't know that much about nuclear weapons and what they can do. And people my age have tended to either forget or actively push this information out of their minds. So let me describe for you what happens if a big bomb goes off over Chicago. And I'll talk about a 20 megaton bomb. We don't have 20 megaton weapons in our arsenal anymore, nor do the Russians. A modern attack on Chicago would probably be 15 smaller weapons, but a single bomb in one place is a little bit easier to think about. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within that entire area, the temperature would rise to 25 million degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the people, the trees, the upper level of the earth itself. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds in excess of 600 miles per hour and overpressures of 25 pounds per square inch. Forces of that magnitude level anything that people can build. To a distance of 6 miles, the heat would be so great that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that everything flammable, wood, plastic, oil, gasoline, paper, cloth, everything would ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering more than 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All the oxygen would be used up, and every living thing would die. In the case of Chicago, that's something like 6 to 8 million people. And if that attack were part of a large-scale attack on the United States, then that same destruction would be visited on every city in our country. 95 million people would die promptly, and the infrastructure on which all the rest of us depend for survival, the economic infrastructure, would be destroyed. And just one last thing about this. 2 things. That destruction would also be visited on the Russians by the counterattack that we launched. And as bad as all this is, that's not the real problem, because a war of this magnitude would cause global climate disruption, dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 8 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop by up to 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's colder than it's been on this planet in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. For 3 years in the Northern Hemisphere, there would not be a single day free of frost. And all agriculture would stop, there would be no food production, and the vast majority of the human race would die. It might even be the extinction of our species. That danger is not just some fantasy that I can spin out for you here today. It is a real and present danger. as long as thousands of these warheads sit on missiles, ready to be launched, as Ambassador Dhanapala has pointed out, and ready to destroy cities across the planet in 30 minutes. The only problem today is that we don't think about this at all. The knowledge of the danger of nuclear weapons has just passed out of public discourse. It's not a problem that we deal with.
Dr. Ebadi.
خیلی ممنونم. من بر حرفای سخنان قبلی میخوام نکته‌ای هم اضافه کنم. ایشون از خطرات استفاده از بمب اتمی صحبت کردن و من میخوام یک کمی اون طرفترش رو نگاه کنم. حتی اگه استفاده نکنیم چه مضراتی میتونه داشته باشه. چرنوبیل یادتون رفت؟ فوکوشیما یادتون رفت؟ بنابراین فقط مسئله بمب اتمی نیست. استفاده از نیروگاه‌های اتمی هم خطرناکه و این بهانه است برای برخی از کشورها که بگویند ما می‌خواهیم نیروگاه‌های برق هسته‌ای داشته باشیم. اما آیا نیروگاه برق هسته‌ای خوبه؟ آیا میخواین یه بار دیگه چرنوبیل و فوکوشیما رو تکرار بکنید؟ و از همه مهمتر با توجه به خطراتی که شنیدید فکر نمی کنم هیچ یک از کشورهایی که این بمب رو دارن جرأت استفاده از این رو داشته باشن، برای اینکه میدونن متقابلا بقیه کشورها علیه اون کشور این بمب رو استفاده خواهند کرد. بنابراین کشورها جرأت استفاده از این بمب رو ندارن. و حالا سوال من اینه چرا بایستی میلیون ها دلار خرج اسلحه‌ای بشود که فقط میخوایم انبار بکنیم و با انبار کردن اون احساس امنیت برای حکومت‌ها درست کنیم؟ نگاه کنید به پاکستان. چقدر مردم گرسنه هستند. آیا بمب اتمی رو میشه خورد؟ چرا این هزینه ها رو بایستی پاکستان یا کشورهای دیگه بکنن؟ پولی که باید صرف رفاه مردم بشه چرا تبدیل به اسلحه‌ای میشه که فقط به درد انبار کردن میخوره؟ بنابراین برای اینکه جلوی جاه طلبی های حکومت ها رو بگیریم میبایستی از طریق یک جنبش بین المللی جلوی ساخت بمب‌های آتی رو در درجه اول بگیریم و بعد در درجه بعد کلیه بمب‌ها رو از بین ببریم و از همه مهمتر نیروگاه‌های هسته‌ای رو هم تعطیل کنیم. ما می توانیم انرژی مفیدتری داشته باشیم. این انرژی خطرناکه.
Here's a fact that I'll just tell you, for those of you who might not know, Dr. Ebadi is from Iran, and Iran is currently the #1 suspect in terms of countries building nuclear weapons. And Iran says that they are simply developing civilian nuclear power. So the two do go hand in hand. And I wanted to add one fact to what she said about the cost of nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't build nuclear weapons anymore, but it spends $7 billion a year just taking care of the ones it already has. So this is an enormous expenditure for any government, even a wealthy one. Mrs. Breines, I want to give you a chance to speak.
The International Peace Bureau is seriously concerned about the militarization that is ongoing in the world, and CIPRI just gave new reports on how much money the world is spending on the military, more than $1.7 trillion a year. That is many zeros. And only 10 to 20% of these costs would be enough, according to the figures of the UN, to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Today, we are speaking this morning of one part of the military budget, and it is a part that should not have existed. It is the human mind's most destructive invention ever. So it's not enough to speak about non-proliferation or getting rid of one missile here and another there and lots of negotiations. We have to have an overall demilitarization plan for the world where nuclear weapons, and also, like Shirin Ebadi said, nuclear energy is part of the picture, because nuclear energy is ruled as illegal. It is also immoral. It should be unacceptable from a political, environmental, and economic point of view. So the world in financial crisis simply does not have the funds to upkeep this militarization. We need the money for food, to fight poverty, providing education, providing possibilities for people to develop their own potential. And we have to stop pointing at each other for being the bad guys. We have to sweep before our own doors. And in 1 month's time, NATO will have its big summit here in Chicago. We have to help the governments of NATO to understand that they have to change their nuclear policy. We have to start on a zero level, and it will take time, and we should use all the creative intelligence of humankind to find out how can we get rid of these nuclear weapons. That is not a particularly easy task either.
You know, Mr. Gorbachev said something very interesting about overall military expenditures. He said the biggest obstacle to nuclear reductions or to the elimination of nuclear weapons is conventional weapons. Because as long as one country feels that it is weaker than its adversary, Pakistan feeling itself weaker than India, it will try to equalize things by developing a nuclear weapon. So we've all agreed that nuclear weapons are an enormous expense, and if they ever go off, the consequences are almost unimaginable. So now let's talk about some specific steps that people can take, countries can take, toward their elimination.
Dave, could I just say one thing about the question of whether a state would use them or not?
Yeah.
Because I think that also goes to the heart of the matter. I think there are two reasons why there isn't a large movement of people today demanding the end of nuclear weapons. One is that people don't understand how bad they are, how bad their use would be. And the other is people don't really think that would happen. They don't think that anyone would use them. And in truth, since the end of the Cold War, the chance of the US and Russia deliberately attacking one another has gone down very dramatically, and that's an enormously positive development. But there still is a very real possibility that a state might use these weapons, not necessarily intentionally. We know of at least 5 times since the late 1970s when either the United States or Russia, previously the Soviet Union, prepared to launch a nuclear war under the mistaken belief that it was under attack by the other side. And the most recent of these was in 1995, 5 years after the end of the Cold War, 6 years after the Berlin Wall came down. There's a real possibility, as long as these huge arsenals exist, that they would be used by accident. There's also, I think, a real possibility that some of the smaller states, there's states possessing smaller nuclear arsenals, like India or Pakistan, which have come very close to war, and to war involving their nuclear arsenals over the last 15 years, could, in fact, if they stumbled into a conventional conflict, also stumble into a nuclear conflict. And so I think we need to take their potential use very seriously. This is not just some theoretical, abstract, bad thing that could happen. It's, I think, a real and present danger. And when I speaking to the young people in the audience, what I would tell you is this: the horrible scenario that I spelled out before is not something, it's not the future that must be, but it is very much a future that may be, if you and we and all of us don't take action to do something about this.
And Pakistan is an example of another danger of nuclear weapons, which is when an unstable country is also a nuclear power. And for whatever reason, the government collapses. And then you have loose nukes in the hands of nobody's sure who. Then you don't have to have a war, but you've got a catastrophe on your hands.
Well, nuclear weapons could be in the hands of a country with a very unstable leader or a megalomaniac like a Hitler who could press the button. And so we cannot rest content that those who have nuclear weapons will never use this weapon because of the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. As Dr. Helfand has said, there is the danger of an accidental nuclear war. There is the danger of terrorists using nuclear weapons. But to answer your question, I think the two biggest possessors of nuclear weapons, the United States and the Russian Federation, must set an example. President Obama, after his very good speech in Prague in April 2009, set in motion a process which led to the New START agreement between the United States and the Russian Federation, and that reduced stockpiles by about 30%. But in order to achieve the ratification of that in the Senate, he had to virtually pledge something like $80 billion for maintaining the nuclear weapon industry here. So in a sense, that was a Faustian bargain, given the political process in this country. Now there is going to be a new round of talks between the US and Russia, which, according to reports, is likely to bring down the level of each country's arsenals to 300 nuclear warheads. That is something to be welcomed. I think that example will help to begin a ripple effect on other nuclear weapon states so that they also then are persuaded into coming into the multilateral process. But ultimately, we must have a nuclear weapon convention. There are 3 categories of weapons of mass destruction: biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons. We have, by 1972's Biological Weapon Convention, outlawed biological weapons. We have, by the 1996 Chemical Weapon Convention, outlawed chemical weapons. And although not every single weapon has yet been destroyed, they have been declared, and there is an organization in The Hague which verifiably supervises the destruction. Now, why can't we have also a nuclear weapon convention with a commitment legally of all countries to get rid of nuclear weapons under verifiable conditions? And then the actual destruction can take place after that. This is what the Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon has proposed in his 5-point plan, and this is what a large number of organizations, including the PUGWASH conferences on science and world affairs, has also endorsed.
But outlawing Okay. Go ahead.
من در تایید حرفای سخنران قبلی که صحبت از کنوانسیون می‌کردند باید بگم بسیار موافقم که یک چنین کنوانسیونی تصویب بشه در مجمع عمومی سازمان ملل و ممنوع بشه. این اولین قدمه، اما فراموش نکنیم کنوانسیون ها برای اینکه قابلیت اجرا پیدا بکنند باید مورد حمایت کشورهای بزرگ هم قرار بگیرند. از همه مهمتر آمریکا باید به این کنوانسیون بپیونده. متاسفانه آمریکا اصولاً کنوانسیون های سازمان ملل رو امضا نمی‌کنه و ملحق نمیشه. یک نمونهش رو من به شما بگم چون در تخصص منه. همه کشورها به کنوانسیون حمایت از حقوق کودک پیوستند، فقط آمریکا نپیوسته و یک کشور دیگه. یا چرا دادگاه ICC، دادگاه بین المللی جنایت علیه بشریت رو که در لاهه تشکیل شده زمان ریاست جمهوری کلینتون امضا کرد، اما کنگره هم باید تصویب بکنه و این امر اتفاق نیفتاد و زمان پرزیدنت بوش حتی امضا هم پس گرفتن. بنابراین من با تایید لزوم کنوانسیونی که مبنی بر منع استفاده و نگهداری و ساخت هر گونه اسلحه اتمی، شیمیایی و میکروبی موافقم و چون اینجا این سمینار در آمریکاست توجه شهروندان محترم آمریکایی رو به این مسئله جلب میکنم که بایستی حکومت آمریکا به کنوانسیون های بین المللی بپیونده و اونا رو حمایت بکنه تا اینکه یک حرکت بزرگ در جهان شروع بشه.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. The fact that there are conventions outlawing chemical and biological weapons has not eliminated chemical and biological weapons programs. There are many countries which have them. And the issue always comes down to, one, verification of abiding by whatever treaty or convention you've signed up to, and two, what are the penalties if you're caught cheating? And when you talk about reducing the number of nuclear weapons, the lower you go, the bigger payoff you get for cheating. If you hide just a few away while everybody else gets rid of theirs, you all of a sudden have a big advantage. So how do you enforce these conventions and treaties and bring about meaningful penalties for violation?
First of all, International Peace Bureau totally agree with the need for a full, comprehensive convention against nuclear weapons. And today we have the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has a dual role of encouraging nuclear energy and seeing to that it is not to be developed into weapons. I think we need to change the mandate of this agency so that it could be the one to look after a convention and help countries in that process. And we need in all the schools programs on peace education where they understand or get to understand the dangers of nuclear weapons. Because if there are enough people, and there are lots of young people here today that say no to nuclear in all its form, the governments in democratic countries will have to abide with what the people says. So I think we have to work on the convention and how to make sure that it is ratified and implemented, and on the other hand work on public opinion, demilitarizing the minds, so to say.
Just to add to the important conventions that the United States, among others, have not signed, there is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, where President Clinton took the remarkable initiative of beginning the negotiating process in the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, was the first to sign the negotiating treaty, but unfortunately, with the change of administration and the Republican majority in the Senate, there has not been a ratification by the United States of that treaty in order to enter it into force. Indonesia recently ratified the treaty, which leaves 8 countries still to ratify it. And there is no doubt that if the sole superpower in the world, the United States, ratifies that treaty, the others will follow suit. On the question of verification, we have today a very sophisticated verification technology. And the technology available in Vienna, in the Secretariat which services the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, is able to pick up any test anywhere in the world. It picked up the 2 North Korean tests, however small they may have been. It was not picked up by many other countries despite the technology that they have available to them. And so to say that verification is inadequate today is a false argument, because we have reached a state-of-the-art technology with regard to verification. And there is also the Security Council, which is able to then intervene and punish those, as they punished Saddam Hussein for the weapons of mass destruction program. They sent in teams of inspectors in UNSCOM, which was led by my friend Ambassador Rolf Ekius, and were able to destroy a substantial part of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, so that when the invasion took place, they found no weapons of mass destruction, and the justification for that invasion was in fact a false one.
You raised a very important question, I think, though, about there are treaties banning biological and chemical weapons, but we still have them in the world. Could a nuclear weapons treaty be different? And I think there is one really important difference between nuclear weapons on the one hand and the other weapons of mass destruction, which is that the technology required to build a nuclear weapon is much more extensive and much harder to hide. You can make biological weapons in your bathtub, and it doesn't take much more than that to make chemical weapons. It's very easy to hide the production of those types of weapons of mass destruction. But the economic, industrial infrastructure required to build nuclear weapons is quite cumbersome. That's why we've been able to track the situation in Iran and North Korea as much as we have been. And I think it would be much harder to hide a clandestine nuclear weapons program than a clandestine biological or chemical weapons program. One other point about that, when we get down to very low numbers, when there are just 100 weapons maybe in the world, this question of, is one country cheating, is one country holding back weapons, is going to become very important. But we're actually, at this point, a long way from that moment. When we've got 20,000 warheads in the world, we shouldn't be worried as much about what's going to happen to that last handful as we should be worried about what's going to happen to the 20,000. And we need to move very quickly to get down to that very low number. A report that International Physicians released yesterday showed that even a very limited nuclear war involving just 100 Hiroshima bombs, about 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenal, could cause climate disruption, not on the scale of the scenario I described before, but bad enough to cause a global famine that could put 1 billion people around the planet at risk. Now, the US in its fleet has Trident submarines. Each Trident submarine can destroy 100 cities. That's the scenario we used in our paper, the destruction of 100 cities causing this kind of famine. The US has 14 of them. We also have a fleet of land-based missiles. We also have a fleet of bombers that can drop nuclear weapons. There is this grotesque overkill capability in the US arsenal and in the Russian arsenal. And we really need to move as quickly as we can to get the numbers way down so that if there is some accident, at least we don't destroy the whole planet.
Let me come back to this verification issue. North Korea has already conducted 2 underground nuclear explosions. Whether or not they were successful is a little unclear, but nevertheless, they've tried to do it twice. And the UN has expressed outrage, and various countries have enacted sanctions against North Korea. But North Korea just keeps right on working on its nuclear program. So if a country is willing to pay the price of being an international pariah in order to get nuclear weapons, how can you stop them?
You can stop them by negotiating with them. President Carter gave a brilliant speech 2 days ago here in Chicago within the framework of the World Summit and told us about how he went to Pyongyang and negotiated. And Bob Gallucci, the current head of MacArthur Foundation, was also privy to that because he was in the State Department. And they signed an agreed framework, which unfortunately did not work. Whether it could have worked better or not is, of course, arguable. There was mutual recrimination about it. But negotiations are possible. We've just concluded last week negotiations in Turkey between Iran and the 6+1 on the question of Iran's nuclear program. And that was a constructive meeting. I'm sure it will lead to further constructive meetings. In the same way, there are the 6-nation talks going on with regard to North Korea. And China is crucial in this. So China, too, would be in a position to help us in order to talk sense with the North Koreans. But the North Koreans are also demanding something. And they want some kind of recognition. They want a closure with regard to the Korean War by signing a truce with the United States, by having diplomatic relations with the United States. People like President Carter and others have done enormous good towards unlocking the problems that exist between governments. And I think more space should be given to mediators like that in order to have progress with regard to the dismantling of potential nuclear weapon programs.
Mrs. Breines.
I do think that the only one that is actually winning from anything that has to do with nuclear weapons is the nuclear weapons industry and their political affiliates. So to quote one woman that is well known in the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Nobody won the last war and nobody will win the next." And certainly if we speak about use of nuclear weapons, it endangers the human beings, it endangers the beautiful planet of ours. So we have to stop accepting this fear that is building up by, I think, the military industry to point at the others as being so dangerous, so we need to protect ourselves. We need this dialogue, we need to speak with each other, have respect, and that is a way of lowering the demand for dangerous weapons in order to be a deterrence against whoever is out there threatening us. I was for a few years in Pakistan for the UN, and I actually just came back. And you can understand that both China and Pakistan and other countries in the area don't exactly get encouraged to demilitarize and disarm if there is made an accord or a contract between the United States and India on their nuclear programs. It's quite threatening for the environment.
Dr. Ebadi wants to say something, but I wonder if I could ask you a question first. Do the people of Iran think they would be better off or worse off with a nuclear weapon?
مردم ایران نه تنها با داشتن اسلحه اتمی مخالف هستند، بلکه حتی مخالف برنامه‌های اتمی، برنامه‌های هسته‌ای دولت هستند و میگویند نیروگاه‌های برق هسته‌ای به درد ما نمیخوره، زیرا ایران خورشید فراوانی دارد. 1/5 خاک ایران کویره. شاید جالب باشد بدانید طبق آمارهایی که گرفتند در 5 سال گذشته گرمترین نقطه دنیا در کویر ایران بود. پس ما می توانیم نیروگاه‌های خورشیدی خوبی داشته باشیم. اما تا کنون حتی دولت $1 هم در این زمینه سرمایه گذاری نکرده. از طرف دیگر ایران روی خط زلزله است و امکان تکرار فاجعه فوکوشیما 2 مرتبه میره در ایران و مردم ایران سوال میکنند از حکومت، حالا که شما نیروگاه اتمی رو راه اندازی کردید، زباله های اتمی رو میخواید چه کنید؟ کجا اونا رو میخواید دفن بکنید؟ و مردم ایران معتقدند هرچه زودتر غنیسازی بایستی متوقف بشود تا تحریم‌های اقتصادی رو از روی ایران بردارند، برای اینکه تحریم‌ها به مردم زیاد صدمه میزنند. اما من مایلم وقتی صحبت از مذاکره با حکومت‌هایی مثل ایران یا کره شمالی میشه به یک مسئله اشاره کنم و آن این است که توافق‌هایی که با چنین حکومت‌هایی می‌شود در زمینه عدم ساخت یا عدم استفاده از جنگ افزارهای خطرناک، آیا این توافق‌ها پایداره؟ آیا غرب می‌تواند به این توافق‌ها اعتماد بکند در حکومت‌هایی که دموکرات نیستند و مردم بر کار حکومت نظارت ندارند، هر لحظه حکومت زیر تعهدش میزنه و همه چی به هم میخوره. و از همین روست من معتقدم برای صلح بین المللی حکومت‌های غیر دموکراتیک خطرناکتر هستند حتی تا بمب اتمی. به عنوان مثال فرانسه بمب داره. آیا شما می‌ترسید از اینکه فرانسوی‌ها بمب اتمی دارن؟ اما بسیار می‌ترسید از کره شمالی، از پاکستان. چرا؟ اونجا یک حکومت دموکراتی هست، نظارت می‌کنند مردم. در جاهای دیگه این نظارت نیست. بنابراین نتیجه گیری می‌کنم وقتی با کشورهایی مثل ایران و کره شمالی صحبت می‌کنید راجع به انرژی هسته‌ای فقط حرف نزنید، بلکه دموکراسی و حقوق بشر هم بایستی مورد مذاکره قرار بگیره. اعتماد نکنید به تعهد کشورهای غیر دموکراتیک. اینها به تعهد خودشون پایبند نخواهند بود.
Okay, we're going to go to questions from the audience now. And this one's a tough one. What can this generation of young people do to help with such global issues? Is it possible for us to make a difference when most adults do not take us seriously?
Wow. Don't think that adults don't take you seriously. They do. And also, you're going to be adults yourselves very soon if you're students still now. I think there's an enormous amount that students can do. In this country, there's a huge tradition of student political activism transforming this country. Much of the power behind the civil rights movement in the 60s came from the student movement. Much of the power that ended the war in Vietnam came from the student movement. I think if students take up the issue of nuclear weapons, they can play a huge role in making our government do the right thing. Don't underestimate yourselves. You've got enormous power if you choose to act.
Everybody wants a piece of this one. Go ahead.
I would warmly endorse what Ira has said just now. I think it's very important to realize that we have scaled great heights in the international community. We have been able to usher in anti-apartheid legislation in South Africa. We have been able to have anti-slavery. We were able to have women's rights. All these were huge, difficult mountains to scale. But with humanity united and with the youth leading the way, particularly in the civil rights movement and in the anti-Vietnam protests on campuses, this was achieved. We know that the campaign in the United States with regard to apartheid began with a boycott movement of the banks and other institutions which invested in South Africa. The same thing can be done with regard to the nuclear weapon industry. And there has just been a new research report published by an organization called ICANN in Australia with a foreword by Bishop Tutu, which talks about the banks specifically, how much money they have invested in the nuclear weapons industry. You can begin by boycotting those banks so that you apply pressure on them, people's pressure, people's power, to ensure that their investment in the nuclear weapon industry ceases.
I also agree that if people really want change, there will be change. And as for the young generation, seeking knowledge is important because the defense and security area is the less transparent of all spheres in the world today. So seek knowledge. Don't believe everything that is given by authorities, even not believe everything that is given by the academic authorities, certainly not political, and the media is often only applauding the mainstream political decisions. So be courageous, seek knowledge, take the time it takes to understand an issue, and then go for what you think is the right thing. And don't forget to have a vision as to what kind of society you would like to see. What would you like the world to look like? Your village or your city, your country, your region, and the world as such. We need to have a scenario for where we would like to be. So I would encourage the young people to really think of what would they like to see the world be like when they get adults, when they get children, and when they become grandparents and would want the best future for their grandchildren.
This is what I like about young audiences. They ask questions, basic questions about things we take for granted. So here's a basic question. Why were nuclear weapons invented in the first place if they are so despicably destructive? Now, I'll give you a quick answer, which is they were invented during World War II when everybody was trying any military means possible to defeat their adversaries. But I don't think we necessarily needed World War II to get to nuclear weapons. If science permits it, it will happen.
For sure. Although it's important, I think the one-word answer to that question is, two-word answer is Adolf Hitler. The scientists who cooperated to build the first nuclear bombs were terrified that Hitler was going to build the nuclear bomb himself. And given what he was doing in Europe, they felt he would use this to terrorize the world. Interestingly, many of those scientists, as soon as it was clear that that danger had passed, took themselves out of that project. They quit the Manhattan Project, which built the bomb, and refused to continue working on nuclear weapons. But by that point, the bomb had been built.
Dr. Ebadi.
Well, I was going to say precisely what was said, and that is that the Manhattan Project was begun because of the fear that Hitler's Germany was going to invent the nuclear weapon. And Joseph Rotblat, who was amongst the pioneers of the PUGWASH conference, and who also shared the Nobel Peace Prize with the organization PUGWASH in 1995, walked out to the Manhattan Project. Immediately, it was conclusively proved that Hitler's Germany was not developing a nuclear weapon. So the justification for the nuclear weapon was no longer there. And yet the weapon was developed and actually used in Nagasaki and in Hiroshima when it was not at all justifiable to use it. And it caused incalculable deaths and damage, for which I'm afraid the US has still not apologized to the people of Japan.
If I may just add that the scientists today, I think, need a kind of code of conduct like the medical doctors have. And the first rule is do no harm. And for the young people who want to go into science, I find that it is a total misuse of intelligence and creativity when you work on finding out the most lethal weapons that can be. So the coming scientists should use their mind to find out what is the best for humanity.
Dr. Ebadi.
مسئله مهم این است که از دانش و تکنولوژی چگونه استفاده بشود. ما اینجا همه برندگان جایزه صلح نوبل هستیم. یادتون هست حتما آلفرد نوبل دینامیت رو که اختراع کرد برای کمک به کارگران معدن بود که با مشقت و سختی زیادی کوه رو میکندن و میخواست به این ترتیب به اونها کمک بشه. اما حکومت‌ها، سیاستمداران از علم سوء استفاده کردند و از این اختراع برای کشتن دشمنانشون استفاده کردند و جایزه صلح نوبل برای این بود و سایر جوایز نوبل که در حقیقت آلفرد نوبل یادآوری میکرد علم باید در خدمت بشریت باشد، نه در خدمت تثبیت قدرت‌های فاسد سیاسی. ما به این نکته باید توجه کنیم و این رو یادمون باشه.
I have to read this question because it doesn't. I'm not going to ask for answers, but you ought to hear it. This is from David Fink. Why do we need violence before peace? So I just let you think about that for a while. I think this is probably because we're close to the end, maybe our last question, and I think probably the one that is most important to this audience. This challenge seems inaccessible to those of us not involved in government. What can citizens do? With the clock ticking, who would like to try to answer that question?
خیلی خوشحالم که من هرگز در هیچ دولتی نبودم. و اجازه بدید چون همیشه توی مردم بودم از طرف مردم صحبت بکنم. مهمترین نقش رو در هر تحول اجتماعی مردم بر عهده دارند. این نیروی مردمه که حکومت‌ها رو عقب میزنه و باعث هر تحول مثبت میشه. اما مردم برای اینکه به این نیرو دست بیابند باید اول آگاهی پیدا کنند به اینکه راه درست کدام است و دوم متشکل بشوند. این مسئله است که حکومت‌های دموکراتیک باهاش مخالفند، غیر دموکراتیک باهاش مخالفند، هم با تشکل‌ها و هم با آگاهی. و این بر عهده ما نهادهای غیر دولتی است که به هر شیوه ممکن با مردم خصوصاً با جوانان صحبت کنیم، با اونها بگوییم و از طریق تکنولوژی مردم با هم متحد بشوند. تنها راه اتحاد این نیست که شما داخل در یک حزب سیاسی بشوید، بلکه تشکل‌های مدنی و گروه‌های مدنی هم بسیار مهمه. متحد بشوید، جلو بروید، پیروز میشوید.
We're out of time. I would just add, vote. So I want to thank our panel, and I want to thank especially our audience, because if nuclear weapons are ever eliminated, it's not going to be the generation that's up here on this stage. It's going to be the generation out there in the audience. So thank you, and we'll conclude.